Okay, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to present this paper on political trust. I have written it with some colleagues, Atle Haugsgjerd, Jo Sagli, and Signe Boksegård, who I think may be here, although I cannot see her. We all work at the Institute for Social Research in Norway. Here is a picture of the institute. It's taken during the one very short week where our cherry tree is blooming. And before I present the paper, I would like to say something very briefly about trust research at our institute, which also explain a little bit, I think, the motivation and the context for this paper. So our institute hosts the Norwegian election studies, which, among other things, monitor the political attitudes, of course, and as part of this, the level of political trust in the Norwegian population. And as Norwegian, we normally flatter ourselves to be a high trust country, but actually when it comes to political trust, there is quite a large variation. And I will show you the distribution, that is what you see here, of the answers from the to the question of how much people trust in local politicians on a scale from 0 to 10. And as you can see, not everyone has high trust. And during the past few years, the trust has actually decreased. And also we have witnessed a polarization of political trust in the sense that trust has fallen, especially among those who already had low trust. And then we currently have a project on trust in science, which also seems to be declining a little bit in Norway, actually. And in the last survey wave in this project, we posed open-ended questions about trust in science and in research. So a little bit the same thing as in the paper I shall present. And then we have conducted projects looking at the impact of terrorism and social and political trust, the importance of trust in cooperation between civil society organizations and public authorities, and the role of different types of vertical and horizontal trust within public organization, and so on. This is just a handful of the trust research projects that we have at this institute or have had. So trust is actually one of the core topics, and especially in the department where I'm working. The article that I shall present to you about what makes people trust and distrust politicians, it came about a little bit by chance, I will say. We were working on a project on the polarization of political trust, and it turned out during this project that we had unused survey panel time. So to make use of the remaining minutes in the survey panel, we came up with the idea of asking open-ended questions about what makes people trust politicians. And our initial motivation was just that we were curious about what people think, what they think about when they are asked to report on trust in politicians. When you work with this and you ask these questions repeatedly about how much people trust in politicians, in municipal councils, in government, and so on, then you start to wonder what kind of pictures people have in their heads in a way when they make these evaluations. So this was what we were curious about. And there are a lot of theoretical accounts and models of how people assess political trust, but to our knowledge, there is little empirical research. So we wanted to give citizens the floor in a way, and not offering them boxes to tick, but giving them the opportunity to think freely about what makes them trust or distrust politicians. So our first research question was therefore on what basis do people judge whether they trust or distrust politicians? And then we were intrigued by studies that indicate that people may use different bases of judgment to when they describe trust and distrust. So we were also interested in whether distrust in people's minds was merely lack of trust, or whether it may be something in its own right that is just or that is judged based on different assessments. So our second research question was therefore, does the basis for trust judgments depend on whether respondents or people are asked to characterize trust or distrust? So what we did was that we posed 2 different open-ended survey questions to a representative sample of about 1,100 Norwegians. And approximately half of the respondents answered a question on what made them trust local politicians, and the other half answered a question on distrust. And we chose to study politicians because or politicians instead of political institutions, because we believe that trust in politicians was most easy to conceptualize in a way for people. And we chose local politicians simply because this polarization study that I talked about, the focus of that study was local political trust. So I will show you the questions. They were formulated like this. This is translated from Norwegian and it sounds a little weird in English, but we have tried to be true to the Norwegian wording in a way. What is important for you to have trust in municipal politicians, and what would you say contribute to distrust in municipal politicians? So as you may see, the questions aren't equal. And ideally, they should have been. They should have been more similar, but because trust and distrust have different normative standings in Norway as elsewhere, I guess, the 2 concepts required slightly different formulations. And I will not go into the considerations we made, but I think that even though this may do something to the validity, or at least we argue that this was the best solution to word the questions a little differently. And it's not that different in Norwegian. So the respondents were also asked to report their trust in local politicians in the traditional way on a 5-point scale ranging from no trust to complete trust. Yeah. Okay. And I will say something about the analytical process. It was partly inductive, partly deductive. Although we really wanted to give the floor to the citizens, as I have said, we did, of course, have some expectations about what kind of judgment basis we were going to find, because we have read about political trust for several years, so we have these expectations from the literature. So our point of departure when we analyzed the data was the typology of van der Meer, who argues that political trust is evaluated along 4 dimensions. The degree to which politicians, in our case, are considered competent, that is, able to perform their job as politicians, whether they are intrinsically committed, which means that they have an intrinsic need to act in line with citizens' interests. Extrinsically committed, which means that citizens can control what political actors do and hold them accountable. And finally, they should be predictable, which means that politicians' behavior is in line with promises and expected actions. And then to this typology, we added a 5th category, responsiveness, which implies that politicians listen, consider, and react to citizens' opinions and interests. So we had these predefined broad categories, but we were also at the lookout for judgment bases that could not be subsumed under these 5 categories, and we will also have to look at for subcategories. So a first reading of the answers revealed that nearly all respondents actually could be subsumed under one of the 5 original categories. At least if we stretch them a little bit, which we have done, and no other substantial categories occurred. And we also identified a number of subcategories, and then we developed a coding scheme, and in a second step, 3 of the authors coded the entire material independently using this coding scheme. And then we calculated the I can never pronounce this, inter-rater agreement coefficients. And they were fine. They were as they should be, acceptable. Okay, so I will show you the results from this first, the overall results. So here you see how often these 5 judgment bases occurred for trust and distrust, and also in total. This is without the subcategories. I will come back to them later. The percentages, these are percentages in the table, and they refer to replies from respondents where a certain judgment basis occurred. And one single response could be coded for several different judgment bases, so it does not sum up to 100. For trust and distrust seen together, as you can see, predictability was the most used judgment basis. 44% used that, and this was followed by intrinsic commitment. And then a little more than 1 in 4 also mentioned the representative's competence. And being responsive was mentioned by 12%. And also there were a few, but very few actually, who mentioned extrinsic commitments. But as you can see, there were significant differences between what people mentioned when they were evaluating trust as compared to distrust. So predictability, for example, was mentioned by more than half of the respondents that were asked to describe trust, but only by a little under a third of respondents describing distrust. And for intrinsic commitment, the pattern was the opposite. It was used far more often to explain what created distrust. And then an analysis of the different judgment bases for trust and distrust showed that these differences remained when we controlled for personal characteristics and the trust level of respondents. So what you can see from this table is that the likelihood of using, or likeliness, I don't know, using predictability, competence, responsiveness, and extrinsic commitment as judgment basis was higher for those who got the trust questions, whereas it was more likely for those who got the distrust questions to use intrinsic commitments as reason. And also this analysis suggests that people who were trustful, it's the second row, political trust 1 to 5, indicate that those who were trustful of politicians and people with high education, they were more likely to mention intrinsic commitment as judgment basis, whereas people who were distrustful were more likely to mention competence. Okay, so now I will go a little deeper into the material and say something about the different categories and subcategories and the differences between how trust and distrust was evaluated. So predictability was the most cited basis for trust judgment in total, and it was also the easiest judgment base to identify because it presented itself through what seemed like ready-made or standard phrases describing how trustworthy politicians, for example, should be true to their word, keep their word, or stick to the party program. There were no subcategories here because all responses were quite similar, and they were about reliability in one way or the other. So this was really the go-to explanation for why people trusted politicians. When this category was used to describe distrust, predictability was mostly referred to in terms of what it was not. So respondents, for example, distrusted politicians who did not keep their word, did not fulfill their election promises, and so on. Okay, so next, intrinsic commitment, and this is the category that I will spend the most time on because I think it's the most interesting. That was the second most cited reason for trust in politicians and the most cited for distrust. And we identified three distinct aspects of intrinsic commitment, which we have called intentions, morals, and attitude. And first, good intentions. They were cited as reason for trust, and bad intentions were cited as reason for distrust. So, for example, selfless politicians who worked for the good of the citizens, they were seen as trustworthy, whereas politicians who were, for example, motivated by personal gain, they were seen as untrustworthy. Simply regarding citizens or simply disregarding citizens' interests was not cited as reason for distrust, or very, very rarely. To be deemed untrustworthy, politicians should be actively motivated by the wrong reasons, such as their own personal gain. A second subcategory of intrinsic commitment referred to the politician's morals. And bad morals were, for example, related to corruption or to operating with double standards, who a lot of the politicians were accused of. And interestingly, this category's kind of default option was oriented or geared towards distrust. So in the few cases where morals were used to describe trust, respondents, for example, described as trustworthy people that were not corrupt or that did not have double standards, and so on. And then the third subcategory referred to whether the politicians had an appropriate attitude, for example, were willing to cooperate with others or have a good tone with political opponents in order to get things done. And politicians were distrusted, for example, because of hateful speech or because they spoke badly about their opponents. So to sum up this category, intrinsic commitment seemed to be assessed along somewhat different axes for trust and distrust. Trustworthy politicians were described as intrinsically committed to the good of the people, whereas untrustworthy politicians were believed to be intrinsically committed to the good of themselves. So the object of intrinsic commitment varied between trust and distrust. And to repeat myself, disregarding the good of citizens was not enough to be deemed untrustworthy. It required some kind of actively bad intentions or bad morals or a bad attitude. So when judged on the basis of intrinsic commitment, trust and distrust actually appear to be more than mere negations or mere opposites. Okay, then I will say something about competence. Here we identified three subcategories, and the first one, abilities, referred to whether representatives were able to perform the job that they were that they should perform. And it included such things as whether politicians had a relevant education, sufficient experience, or whether they had knowledge about specific policy issues. It also referred to the intelligence and aptness of politicians, or in the case of distrust, to the lack of abilities, a lack of intelligence, and so on. For example, politicians were described as untrustworthy because they didn't understand complex issues and they were stupid and things like that. A second category concerned the representatives' ability or inability to act, to make decisions and to see the decisions through to implementation, including the ability to deliver results. And then a third category we call responsibility. People trusted those politicians who, for example, looked far ahead, acted in a rational way, or had the ability to make priorities. And they distrusted those who, for example, made economically unsustainable decisions or flawed decisions in some way or other. Under responsiveness, we identified 3 subcategories. The first one, listening, referred to whether representatives listened to citizens and took their opinions and interests into account in the policy making. And untrustworthy politicians, they simply did not listen. That was how they were described. And then classified as a second subcategory, where reference is made to the visibility of politicians. So, for example, visible and present politicians, they inspired trust, and invisible or withdrawn politicians, they inspired distrust. And a third subcategory included reference to socio-demographic representativeness. And these references were not about how the representatives acted, but about how their ability to be responsive was a product of who they were. So politicians were regarded as trustworthy and better able to understand the needs of their constituents if they were, for example, born in the municipality, if they were not too young or not too old, and had the right occupation and things like that. So these were descriptive characteristics in a way that made people look at these politicians as more responsive. So actually it's a kind of a descriptive representation that is described here. And they were deemed untrustworthy if they were, for example, out of touch with ordinary people, or came from the wrong part of the municipality, or were too old, or whatever. And finally, only one subcategory was identified under intrinsic commitment, and this was transparency. And like the morals category under intrinsic commitment, transparency was also somewhat negatively conceived of. So when used as an argument for distrust, references were made to intransparency, for example, that decisions were made in the back room or shielded from public scrutiny. When used to describe trust, respondents mentioned the lack of intransparency. For example, the importance of decisions not being made in the back room. Okay, so these were the content in a way of the subcategories, and an account of how trust and distrust was conceived of and assessed differently. So what did we find? We found what I just presented, but I will draw attention to 2 points, or maybe it's not 2. I will see. Okay, so first we found that the 5 judgment bases that we used, they actually captured the majority of people's trust and distrust judgments, and therefore we argue that they can be a useful point of departure for analyzing the reasons for political trust and distrust. 3 of these 5 somewhat abstract judgment bases could be divided into more concrete subcategories, and these subcategories they represented different aspects of the main categories, and they demonstrate the different ways in which these overarching judgment bases are applied in practice. And second, we found that citizens give different weight to the 5 judgment bases when they evaluate trust and when they evaluate distrust. The main tendency is that while trust is more often evaluated with reference to predictability, as I showed you, then distrust is more often evaluated with reference to intrinsic commitment. That is the clearest pattern. So when people evaluate whether they should trust politicians, they first check whether the politicians act in accordance with their words. But when they evaluate whether they should distrust politicians, they assess their intentions, morals, and attitudes. That is to put it simply, of course, but that was the tendency. For 4 of the 5 judgment bases, trust and distrust seem to be assessed along the same axis, in the way that predictability generated trust, unpredictability generated distrust. And in the same way, competence, responsiveness, and transparency generated trust, and incompetence, unresponsiveness, and intransparency generated distrust. For intrinsic commitment, however, trust and distrust were not to the same extent assessed along the same axis. To be distrusted, it was not enough to be intrinsically uncommitted to the interests of the citizens. Untrustworthy politicians were described as being actively committed to themselves and their own interests. So for intrinsic commitment, the content of the poles of the axis did not mirror each other in a way. So based on these findings, we argue that trust and distrust are more than pure negations, because people give different weights to the different judgment bases when they evaluate trust and distrust, and because the important trust, the judgment basis, intrinsic commitment, is not entirely bipolar. So this shouldn't be exaggerated, because there are also 4 of the 5 judgment bases could actually be described as axis, but anyway, it indicates that they are not entirely opposites. We argue that this asymmetry suggests that the cognitive processes that are involved when making judgments about trust may differ from those involved in making judgments about distrust. Okay, so to conclude, I will point at 2 possible implications of our findings. First, and this is a little obvious, but nonetheless important, our study shows that trust is judged differently by different people. And that means that a politician cannot appear trustworthy to all voters at the same time. Some voters will want the politicians to be predictable, others will want them to be responsive and hence flexible, which is the kind of the opposite of being predictable. So these things cannot be realized at the same time, and you can have arguments for all the different judgment bases in the same way. And second, the way politicians are presented, for example through the media, will matter. If these findings have something true to them, how people are presented will matter differently for building trust and for generating distrust. For example, if the media directs its attention towards whether politicians keep their promises, this can affect assessments of trust, but it is less likely that it will affect assessments of distrust. And if the focus is on politicians' intentions, this will not necessarily affect assessments of trust, but may affect assessments of distrust, if you think that these are opposite concepts. So if I was a politician and wanted to be trusted, I would emphasize I would rather emphasize how I kept the promises to my voters than to tell them how I care about the welfare of all citizens, because people actually don't care about that when building trust. It is only or it's more used to tear trust down and to create distrust. Okay, so finally, I will very briefly touch upon whether the typology we have developed can be used in another context, whether it can be transferred to other contexts. And most likely, I think everyone knows, the assessments of trust and distrust will be affected by contextual factors such as political institutions, political culture, existing trust levels, and so on. And the patterns we observe in this study are not necessarily, and most likely not, possible to generalize beyond the Norwegian local context. But still, and I will conclude by suggesting this, although the distribution of reasons for trust and distrust vary according to context, the typology itself is not necessarily context specific. And our hope is that this typology can be useful as a tool for comparing how trust and distrust is assessed or judged in different political contexts. So this was all I wanted to say, and now you get one more picture of our institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting talk and for your wonderful pictures of your institute. In the summer in Norway, which is sometimes less than 1 month, I guess, but it's an intense summer. Thank you very much. And now the floor is open for Q&A. We have lots of hands coming up. So the first one is Claudia Palt from the Vienna team in TRUEDEM. Claudia.
Yes, thank you. It was really interesting for me, since we also work on trust and trustworthiness. And I found some quite similar results in interviews with politicians. And so I'm thinking of it. I just got the impression now, and I want to incorporate it into my thinking of the interpretation of those interviews. So thank you. It was inspiring.
Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah.
Because we did in our project many interviews with politicians, and now we're in the stage of analyzing this qualitative data. And for us, your scheme is very interesting as one of the possibilities of interpretation of these thousands of pages of text of politicians.
Can I ask you one question about that? Because so what you're saying is you're interviewing politicians, not citizens, but politicians. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Claudia, you can say who was interviewed in Austria and other countries.
Yeah, so to be very briefly, we interviewed politicians and CSOs. In Austria, we did about 40 face-to-face interviews. And in other countries, it was between 20 and 40. And they did some focus groups with the people, not with politicians, CSOs. So we have now, I think, more than 2,000 pages of all the transcripts. So interviews with politicians on different level. and with CSOs. And so some of the questions sound quite familiar to me. So when interpreting the stuff. So what I heard in the interviews is, if you say something, it's not that horrible, but if you do something. So you had you're on the same line, I think, when there's an experience which shows, I mean, a discussion or a video or something, then it's in the brain much more. When people say it or it's written in newspaper, you can say another opinion. So it's, yeah, this is very interesting.
Thank you. That sounds very interesting.
Yes, we can stay in touch about this.
Yeah.
Yes, are there any other comments, questions?
I would
Yes,
like
please.
to ask. Hello, thank you very much for amazing research and presentation. I want to refer to the last point you made, that you assume that through different cultural zones, this might be not necessarily changeable, right? So that could be a good framework to take a look and compare. So you published in the West European Journal, right? Do you think that what's happening in East Europe right now may be having completely different range of the parameters, specifically when we are now at war and the trust is now such a crucial parameter, which probably may be having very few parameters of the normal, protected, peaceful situation. So what are your thoughts on that? And do you think it could be a great idea to maybe ask the very same questions from the population of the same demographics, but for example, in the East Europe?
That's a really good question, and I haven't thought about it because, but what came to my mind was this, and of course, war changes everything because people are afraid and they feel insecure, and they maybe have this need for trust, which is reflected in various countries in this rally around the flag effect that you see when people are scared. So that might be something, but as for the typo, of course, I would think would be really interesting if you could use this typology in another context than in a war context. But perhaps, and I would have to reflect more on this, and perhaps you are better at that. There would be other aspects that are not included in this typology in a war situation because it's so special. But that would be really, really interesting.
Thank you, Professor Pieper Norris.
Hello.
We can't hear you.
Pieper, can you unmute?
I apologize. So I enjoyed reading the paper and your presentation. The question I have to ask is, this is perceptions of politicians' responsiveness and their intrinsic integrity and so on. Have you gone further? I wasn't clear to actually analyze the object of trust. In other words, if you have different politicians, can you use any objective evidence or subjective evidence which could measure their performance in order to see whether they were more responsive, they were more, they had greater integrity and things like that. So we get both sides of the equation. Otherwise, we don't know whether it's a projection, motivated reasoning, or whether it's reality, i.e. a more rational assessment.
Yeah, that's a really good question and a very tough or a hard thing to do, I think, because these would be, we would have to measure, we haven't done it, of course, but we have discussed it in another project where we are actually interviewing both politicians and citizens, but we would have to measure responsiveness. We would have to operationalize that, but also all the other things. Are they keeping their promises? Are they, what are their intentions? And that is next to impossible to measure in an objective manner, I think. But it would be worth trying, I think. And it's a really interesting discussion because, as you say, obviously these are just perceptions. But as such, I think that perceptions are interesting because, for example, at the moment, the trust is falling in Norway, and we have had all these scandals where politicians have, I don't know, slept with other very young politicians or taken other people's money and things like that, and had to leave parliament and leave government and everything. And then everyone says, "Oh, trust is falling because we have had all these scandals." But at the same time, the economy is declining. And that I would say that is a better, I would bet on the economy rather than the scandals, but we don't know. So we just see these things happening at the same time, and then we measure the perceptions and how to connect these things. I would really like to do it, but I don't have a good idea on how I would go about to do it actually.
People, and then Gordon.
Just one suggestion. The comparative candidate study is one of the best to look at roles, motivational beliefs, and a whole bunch of other things, which certainly tries to look at things like constituency service or parliamentary activity and so on. I don't know if one could somehow match your sample of politicians. It's a cross-national survey, which is really good. It's been done a couple of times. So that would be one place I'd look at, along with things like indicators of constituency service, how many meetings do they have in their local constituency, and or if you do content analysis of the coverage of the politicians is an obvious way to try to code their actual behavior.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll take myself off.
Yeah, thank you. These are very good suggestions. I will note them. And yeah, these are really good suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon.
You're asking, so you're calling on me? Sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been very intriguing and interesting for me as a politician who has spent, I live in Canada, and I've spent 42 years in elected office, starting when I was first going to university at local level, and then 20 years as a provincial, and then at the House of Commons. And through that process, I did my doctorate as well, looking at it. So it's interesting to hear the comments you're making, and particularly when I did my doctorate, I looked at the difference between emotional and rational decision-making in the processes they applied to politicians in particular, and the messages that went out with that. And certainly I was interested in the work of Daniel Kahan, who said that what most of us believe about issues doesn't reflect what we know, but expresses who we are. And it seemed that only when politicians or leaders see that a policy or a practice in some way has a consistency with whatever group values are, then they become receptive to the evidence and become receptive to the presenter, the messenger, who becomes so much more important in the correlation between the messenger and the message. So to ensure information, I think, is supported by diverse groups of experts and influential people. There has to be an affirmation in terms of people's values and the connections that they have. So that was basically my experience. And certainly, again, doing my doctorate at Simon Fraser University, it was basically looking at the visceral or emotive connectedness and decision-making process as opposed to the rational one. And Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, basically said we make decisions emotionally and justify them rationally. So how do we connect with people, recognizing that they have their own, we each have our own sense of belief and who we are and what our personality is. So how do we connect with that level and then be able to convey information from that? So I found what you presented very interesting in that. And when you kept talking about politicians, I think, are you talking about me? And then going on and trying to balance that. So it was thank you for this. It's been an interesting look at that and juxtaposition to my personal experiences and the theoretical connections that I had in terms of working on my doctorate as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Okay, we have still 10 minutes. Are there any other question, comments? Yes, Professor Kuzina from Kharkiv University in Ukraine.
First of all, thank you so much for your interesting presentation. It's very inspiring. I saw that in your open-ended questions, you asked about municipal politicians. Did you do any research on national level politicians? I mean, president or a state or a head of governments? If so, what do you think? Is there any specific interest in those kind of politicians? If you didn't address it, okay, please tell me that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. We haven't done that, and we certainly would like to do that if it's possible. It's in Norway, I guess it's the same everywhere. It's much harder to get hold on the national politicians than the local ones. So that's a kind of bias towards research on local politicians. But my guess would be that people expect more responsiveness from local politicians than they do from the national politicians. And that would be my guess, but I don't know. And perhaps also, if we did this on national politicians, we should ask open-ended questions. We should ask open-ended questions, because maybe there are other things that are important when people evaluate national politicians. So that would be really interesting, and it would be we didn't suggest that, but I was thinking now that would be really an interesting way to go forward, just to look at whether the basis of judgment of local and national politicians are different indeed. And also in Norway, it's, I don't know how that is in other countries, but the trust in local politicians have traditionally been a little bit higher than trust in national politicians.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irina. Yes, Dr. Burkhard von Lüneburg.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I was wondering if you find a difference if you look at different, or if you can imagine that there's different if you look at partisanship. So if you look at the different parties, because now if you ask the people to evaluate politicians, did you also ask them if who they think about when they do this evaluation, or what the criteria are? Because I could imagine there's a difference between if they now in their minds evaluate somebody they voted for to get into office, or if they evaluate an opposition candidate. So for one, there may be more like, did they actually fulfill their promises? And for the other one, it may be rather, are they involved in any scandals, because they might not even know what they stand for. Is there, I don't know if you did this, I didn't have time to read the full paper, or if there is the option to include this, because that would be very interesting.
Yeah, that we unfortunately we didn't do that, but I think that would have been really interesting. My guess would be that when they are asked about trust, they think about those they voted for, and when they are asked about distrust, perhaps more those they didn't vote for, but I don't know that either. And we tried to, I don't remember whether this was in the analysis or the Logit analysis, I don't think so, but we tried to see whether people from different parties assessed trust and distrust differently, but we didn't find any. There were some small significant coefficients, but they were really small, and we couldn't explain them. And there are a lot of parties in Norway, so we didn't do that. But to ask them who they think about, that would be a next step, I think. And that was kind of, we didn't do it, but it was kind of the initial idea, actually, because we wanted to get to know what pictures they got in their heads. What are they thinking about? Because I think that when we evaluate things, we very quickly get a kind of example or picture in our head, and often we base the evaluation of that first picture coming up and what that is. I think if you ask people some months ago about national politicians in Norway, they would immediately think about all these government members who had to go, or many people would do that. So it would be, yeah. data would be really polluted in a way by these pictures. But yeah, I don't know. That's also way forward, I think. Lots of interesting research question that we have to ask
in the future.
in the future. Yeah.
Very good. I get some ideas for future research, and we are the same. Thank you, Leonard. Last 3 minutes, the last chance before the bell rings. The webinar will be on YouTube, so if you want to admire your own questions again, and if you want to admire the webinar, you can look it up on our YouTube channel. So there seems to be, and the paper is also available, I think.
Yeah, it's open access.
So you can read the paper, the article, and you can see the YouTube video of this webinar of today. Okay, then I think we have lots of ideas for future research in our different teams, and I would like to thank you again for your extremely interesting talk and for your contributions, which are really very fruitful for our current research on trust in European democracies. Thank you very much, and all the best, and take care, and goodbye to the audience. And thank you for your good questions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.